Please pray with me. God, we give you thanks for the reading of your word. God, we give you thanks for all of the gifts that you give. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This Sunday is the first Sunday of the Christmas season. And during this season, we celebrate the birth of the babe Jesus. We celebrate the birth of the baby Jesus. And we give honor and praise to Jesus, that babe who was born in a manger 2,000 years ago. And the many events, like we'll be celebrating Three Kings shortly, that surrounded the birth and upbringing of this precious child coming into the world. And along with Jesus' birth, we also celebrate and magnify, as John says, the light and the life that is the light that was coming into the world when Jesus came into the world. That light, John says, shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Now, have you ever asked yourself, what could it possibly mean for the light to shine in the darkness and that the darkness did not overcome it? Have you ever asked yourself that question? What does that mean? It sounds good, right? Sounds nice. Well, I've given it some thought, and my perspective is this. One possible significance is that the world, as we look around, has a lot of darkness in it, right? Has a lot of suffering and sin and death. So when John says that the light was coming into the world and the darkness did not overcome it, I believe one thing that John was trying to say was that this sin and the darkness and the death that we see in the world, we can't pretend that it doesn't exist, right? Is neither eternal nor omnipotent. It's not forever and it's not all powerful. And we have both the responsibility and the ability, with the grace of God, to overcome it. We have both the responsibility and the ability, with the grace of God, to overcome it. So, as we read this prologue and we hear this talk about the darkness, we see that John and the Christian faith take seriously this idea that there is darkness in the world. And I think it's crucial that we as Christians, we can't just have a sort of pie in the sky understanding of faith or a rosy understanding of the world that we live in, right? Like everything's hunky-dory, a hunky-dory faith. We have to take seriously the presence of evil and wrongdoing in the world. In its most extreme form, I think, the participation in that darkness can be described what Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher, who knows Sartre, the philosopher, existentialist, said that in human nature, there's this feeling that we have the fundamental right to kill. I know that sounds harsh, right? The fundamental right to kill. It's an attitude that can overpower us, can establish itself at our center. It makes us suppress, degrade, mistrust, and trample upon other people. The Mexican exegete, José Porfirio Miranda, relates this tendency to the theological concept of sin. Sin, taken in the context of John, is that we all have the capacity to participate in that darkness. We all have the capacity to harbor that feeling within us that we have the right to trample upon others, even to kill. In times like today, that reality is pretty evident around us. In the Advent season, we took some time to contemplate the darkness, right? And just last night, I don't know if you saw, I mentioned it in my prayer, but there was this horrible attack on the home of a rabbi in Rockland County. This man entered with a big knife and started attacking people. And just before Hanukkah started, there was this attack on a kosher grocery store in Jersey City. The darkness is with us. The darkness is palpable around us. The right to take life. And just before Christmas, I was kind of astonished to read that the American Congress, both Democrats and Republicans alike, this is not a partisan commentary, but voted all together to authorize another defense spending bill bigger than any that had been done in the past. Right after we had these Afghanistan papers that had revealed to us just how much of a failure the war in Afghanistan had been. In other words, the sense that we have the right to take life is something we do on a national level, that we do on a worldwide level. When we think about these things, it can seem like the darkness is looming ever larger in our world. In times such as these, it's easy to start believing that it's just something to do with human nature. That it's just something we can't really do anything about, this darkness or the sinfulness or the way we hurt each other like this, that we just are fated to keep doing it. It's something we can mitigate, but never fully eliminate. And in that way, the darkness begins to take on some kind of mystical, sort of superhuman form. Something that we don't fully understand, can never fully get our heads around, or snuff out from our midst. But that is not the gospel message. That is not the gospel message. John doesn't say there was darkness in the world and that was it. John says a light shined in the darkness and the darkness did not overcome it. The light shined in the darkness and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John, says John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. The true light that enlightens everyone. We are not forever condemned to live covered by darkness. We are not forever tainted by sin or wrongdoing. This theological anthropology is actually antithetical to the Christian faith. It is against what Jesus Christ came and lived and fought and died for and hoped to achieve. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The conversation about racism in the church and in I think a lot of broader society has taken on this traditional doctrine of original sin. Let me explain what I'm talking about. In the traditional notion of sin, according to Augustine and other, fathers of the church and more recent iterations of it, We're all sinners, right? That's a classic doctrine. We're all sinners, and when we repent, we can find God's love and mercy. But we're still sinners. That's how the traditional way of thinking goes, right? We all are going to continue to have this tendency to sin, so we need to continue asking for God's grace. And so we kind of like get a little bit better and better, but we're always there in a way. Has anybody ever heard this line of thinking before? Yeah, it's pretty familiar, right? Standard doctrine. And I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with it. But the danger with that traditional paradigm of sin is that it makes sin something we can never overcome. We're always going to have it with us. What we've done in conversations about racism is that we've taken this understanding and said, racism is like that. We're always going to be racists. I, as a white man, I'm also mixed race, but as a white man, I'll always have racism within me. And so I'm always going to be, dealing with that, and I can ask God for forgiveness and try to do things differently, but I'm always going to have these tendencies within me. Has anybody heard a conversation like that before? Kind of standard conversation about racism. So why is it problematic? I would say it's problematic because it lets us off the hook. It lets us say, okay, well, that bad thing, that racist thing happened over here at one time, but, we're all sinners. So the darkness is, going to be with us all the time, so, we just have to shine a little bit of light. Let me give you an example. I went to this workshop, an anti-racism workshop, back in the fall in October. It was a very good workshop, and we spent a lot of the time talking about the history of white supremacy and how it's permeated everything we do as a society and as a culture. We learned about a lot of different things. Good conversations. But I noticed at one point that not once did we talk about why it is that the United Church of Christ, the denomination that I love and belong to, why is 90% white? Reverend John's laughing. Nor did we address in the Metropolitan New York Association of the United Church of Christ, in New York City is what I'm trying to say, of the probably 70 people that were gathered at that workshop, I could raise two hands and count on my fingers the number of people like me who are of mixed race, of Asian and Latinx descent. Why? We didn't even want to talk about it. And I was particularly blown away when this African-American reverend that I know and love raised his hand, and he said, I want to know why, after 14 years as an ordained minister in this association, I've never received a call. A call meaning an appointment to a church. In New York City, in the Metropolitan Association of the United Church of Christ. Why? And what I realized was that the framework that we were using to talk about racism, the same framework that we use to talk about sin, was giving us a pass. It was giving us a way out of the conversation. It was a way for us to say, just like, yes, we're sinners, but we're in recovery and repentance, we're getting better. It was a way to say, those things that keep happening, well, they're just part of the racism that's permeating the culture, and it's never going to be fully eradicated, so we just have to kind of like work on making it better here and there. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say? But the whole point of the Gospel of John is that that's not the way it's supposed to be. John doesn't say Jesus came and there was darkness. Jesus says a light shone in the darkness and the darkness did not overcome it. And that light has the power to illuminate everyone, not just someone. All of you, all of me, not just half. You see, to portray racism or homophobia or sexism or any other manifestation of darkness in our world or in ourselves, to portray it as this thing that is bigger and mystical and outside of ourselves that we can never fully control, is to grant it more power than God. Is to grant it more power than God. And it is to ultimately relinquish our own responsibility over its effects. I know I'm sounding emphatic, but I get emphatic about this point. It encourages us to relinquish our responsibility over its effects. Jose Porfirio Miranda, probably my favorite exegete of the book of John, says, of the feeling that we have the fundamental right to kill, that this deviation can be eradicated. If it could not, if we were not free to be otherwise, we would not experience it as guilt. And Miranda also says, according to Genesis and to St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, original sin is a contingent event and therefore eradicable from human society. In other words, we can, with God's grace, overcome sin and eradicate it from human society. As a mixed-race person, a person of both Asian and European descent, a person who grew up in a community that's overwhelmingly white, I am deeply committed to this notion that the effects of racism can be fully eradicated. And I'm committed to the belief in the full power and efficacy of God's grace in that process. The full power and efficacy of God's grace in that process. Let me explain. Growing up, and I didn't realize this until much later, I had some family members who are, Italian and white, beloved people that I love, but talked a lot when I was growing up about how the European civilization is the best, and about how the rest of the world, especially Asians, were savages, inferior, not as advanced, somehow less than. As a young boy, I internalized that message without even thinking. You do that when you're a kid. You don't even think about how that's impacting you. It just becomes part of your way of thinking. I began to look at parts of myself, my heritage, where I come from, or where my family comes from, parts of my own body as being less than, less worthy, less valuable. It was only by the grace of God, I would say, through my own Christian journey, my discovery of this concept that we are all fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, that Jesus himself rose from the grave, overcame sin and death, that I myself was able to reject the lies that racism had told me and integrate a more healthy and wholesome understanding of myself. In other words, when John says, to all who receive him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. I see in that statement my own transformation, my own journey to wholeness, my own journey to love. And I have this belief, and you could say that I'm wrong, but I believe that my white brothers and sisters can also make that journey too. I believe that they have the ability, that anyone has the ability to look at me or anyone else and love them as a child of God, and to be liberated from the chains of racism. I believe that. This message of this light shining in the darkness, beyond the connotation of sin, has real resonance and power for anyone who is struggling with any kind of personal difficulty. The fundamental message is, if the light shines in the darkness and the darkness did not overcome it, and you can be fully illuminated, if that's the message of the gospel this morning, if that's the Christmas message this morning, then there's no circumstance that you are in that cannot be completely transformed. There is no challenge that you're seeking to overcome that you cannot overcome. There is no sin. There is no despair. There is no darkness so great that the light cannot illuminate it. This is the gospel message. No one is beyond redemption in the Christian faith. So when we look out over a world that is clearly still inhabited by the darkness, it is our job as Christians to bring the light. It is our job to bring the light. If our brother is out there carrying a gun or a knife, ready to enter another one of the precious temples of our Jewish brothers and sisters, it is our job as people of faith, if it's safe for us in that moment, to take that gun from his hand, take that knife from his hand, and kindle in the place of hate the fire of love. If our congressmen and women, Democrat or Republican, are convinced that we need to keep having war after war after war and spend more money on the machine of death, then it's our job to replace them all with people who are going to put that money and resources and energy into education, healthcare, peace, and human flourishing. And if our society, if our church is still manifesting the sin of racism and segregation, it's not our job to say, well, we're going to be racist forever because we're all sinners that need to be redeemed. It's our job to find the places that are still segregated, that are still examining or still exhibiting that inequality, and transform it to bring the light where the darkness still resides. For John assures us that to those who believe, and by believe I mean those who truly perform acts that are consonant with God's redemption and God's justice, to those who open themselves up to the redeeming power of God's grace, the Word will become flesh and will live among us. And we will come face to face with God's glory, the glory as of a parent's only child, full of grace and truth. Amen.